I'm Colin Sanders, and you're listening to the History Books Review. I read history books and I review them. Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Chapter 18, Part 1. Scientific papers nowadays have a thing called an impact factor, which is worked out by some tremendously complicated algorithm which I don't personally understand, but which is supposed to capture just how big an influence any particular paper has had on the field. No one's ever worked out an impact factor for Roman emperors yet, but if they did, Constantine would probably be about the top of the table for it. If it weren't for Constantine, it's quite likely that very few of us would have ever been inside a Christian church. The city he founded bore his name right up until the lifetime of my grandfather, and it's still one of the largest in Europe. 10 more emperors were to bear the name Constantine, and when Greece became an independent nation in the modern era, several of its kings were also called Constantine, and Constantine remains a popular name both there and elsewhere. Throughout Europe, even now, aristocratic titles hark back to the ranks in Constantine's army. So, given the huge influence he'd had, it's not surprising that a lot of people have been curious about the kind of man he really was. Opinion about him's been divided since his own time. He's always had a good press from the religion which he did so much to promote. This has led to something of a backlash against him from people who aren't so keen on his religious reforms. It's easy to criticise Constantine from a modern perspective, of course, because our values are so different nowadays. But then you can say that about any Roman emperor, really. The emperors of Rome were not nice, cuddly people. They were all brutal dictators and had no regard whatever for the rights of their subjects. So the question really is, how did Constantine stack up compared to his peers? One thing is for sure, he was a complicated guy. As a young man, he was tall and good-looking, and seems to have got on with everyone. He was active and diligent, working hard on the paperwork and the admin stuff, even though his active nature and lack of education must have made this kind of thing hard work for him. And there is no doubt at all about his ability as a general. I've just had a quick look at his military career, and he either won or drew every battle he fought, which is quite remarkable, really. And most of his best-known battles were against fellow Romans, and many were against the odds, so he wasn't simply trading on the well-known military superiority of the legions. He was bold when it was required, but he was hardly reckless. So he ranks well in comparison with other military successes like Trajan and Aurelian. In an age where the ability to lead troops in the field was a key skill, this was important. But there is more to being a successful emperor than just effective skull-bashing, and again, his grasp of politics and getting things done puts him up there with the likes of Caesar and Diocletian. His personal relationships with those around him are much more ambiguous. Putting aside his first wife in favour of a politically advantageous marriage to Fausta, the daughter of the Emperor Maximian, seems harsh to modern eyes, but at the time that wouldn't have raised an eyebrow. It was a world where status, connections and pedigree were paramount, and so that would have been regarded as par for the course. But he did show a willingness to stick by his son from his first marriage, and this was actually more likely to attract disapproval. The obscurity of his mother put Crispus at an initial social disadvantage, but Crispus was groomed to be Constantine's successor. As a teenager, he was made a Caesar and given some key commands. And these commands weren't just paper ones either. In one of the key civil wars, at the Battle of Byzantium, he led the decisive naval coup with courage, and it was the success of that which tipped the battle in Constantine's favour. Success in arms would have trumped any doubts about Crispus, and he was young and he became very popular. That's the sort of way these things work, isn't it? It's always the young royals that get the crowd behind them. This ought to have been a great asset to Constantine's regime. Constantine had obviously fought and killed his way to the top, and although propaganda can achieve much, the plain facts were known to everyone. Constantine was only the unrivalled ruler of the Roman world because he'd killed all the rivals. Having a blameless successor should have been a great card to play, offering the hope of a legitimate and stable future. It was, after all, not Crispus who had killed Maxentius and Licinius, but it was not to be. In 326, Crispus was killed on Constantine's order. The exact manner of his death is unclear, but it involved a trial and was a bit of a public event. Shortly afterwards, his stepmother, Fausta, was also killed, again on Constantine's orders. This one was an in-house event. In her case, the method used was to place her in an overheated steam bath in the palace. This is a curious means of execution, and it suggests to me at any rate that the intention was to kill her without giving her any prior notice that she was being killed. So, in a very short period of time, Constantine had killed both his son and his wife. The precise details of how, why and what motivated it all haven't survived, and this has encouraged a lot of speculation ever since, and no doubt plenty of gossip at the time. But it's hard to see any way it can be turned round to make Constantine look good. With Crispus out of the picture, the succession issue was much less clear-cut. Constantine had 3 sons by Fausta: Constantine, Constans and Constantius. They were obviously much younger than Crispus, and so were not nearly so well suited to succeed. Was one going to inherit, or were they going to share power? It wasn't an easy decision to make, and Constantine chose to make it tougher still by elevating a couple of their cousins as well. And to throw in yet another random factor, he created a couple of new titles. The cousins were Dalmatius and Hannibalianus. Hannibalianus was married to Constantine's daughter, Constantina, and he was raised to the status of nobilissimus. I'm not sure exactly what that means. It may well be that people at the time weren't sure exactly what that meant either. But Hannibalianus got another title, the meaning of which was not so ambiguous. He was also declared King of Pontus. It was the first appearance of that title applied to a Roman since the kings had been expelled from the city over 1,000 years before. Gibbon doesn't seem to have thought of one possible explanation of this, that it was simply intended that Hannibalianus was going to be imposed on the Persians as their king once the Romans had defeated them in war. But even if this was the intention, it was a sort of significant moment when the thought of a Roman emperor as a king in name as well as in fact became once again possible. But whatever they were called, it is obvious with hindsight that elevating so many individuals to the top rank was a risky strategy. It can't have seemed all that smart a move even without hindsight. Constantine needed only to look back on his own career for an example of how sharing power between peers had led to conflict. And so it was to prove again, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. We're still looking at the character of Constantine himself. Maybe his intention was to set up a sort of Darwinian struggle for survival, where the fittest successor would emerge from a struggle between them. Who knows? It seems quite likely that Gibbon was right to draw a distinction between the early and the later Constantine. The youthful Constantine had been a skilled general, but he always worked in a way that showed a good sense of political judgment as well. We see him biding his time when it suited his purpose, and acting decisively when he thought it was worth taking a risk. It sounds a far cry from the older Constantine, whose succession plan seemed to be so inept and to more or less guarantee a civil war. His poor preparation for his own demise is really the biggest error of his reign. His squeezing the pips out of the poor was a continuation of the earlier policy of Diocletian, and was to be continued afterwards by his successors. It was pretty much the only way the empire could be made to work at this stage, so it isn't really a personal failing of Constantine himself. His increasing reliance on German soldiers was to prove disastrous in later reigns, but in principle there was no reason why this should have been the case. The empire had absorbed plenty of immigrants in the past, and could have continued to do so, and indeed it could have been a source of great strength. His rule was effective enough, though he doesn't quite show the administrative genius of Diocletian. He was paranoid enough to believe in conspiracies against him. That may have been what did for poor Crispus. Decrees survive of punishments meted out to a wide range of courtiers. Jealousy for the youth of Crispus is another possible explanation, and if so, that were indeed a grievous fault. We hear that as he grew older, he became vain, sporting absurd hairpieces and wearing ridiculous silk garments that were simply not appropriate to the dignity of an emperor of Rome. It turns out that you can have a major influence on the development of Western civilization and still be a prat. The contrast between his earlier worthy treatment of Crispus and his darker later behaviour is another example of this decline with age. So, if you want to love Constantine, you'll be better off concentrating on the energetic young general. If you want to think of him as an evil monster, well, he got there in the end. It is said that after his murder of Crispus, graffiti appeared on his palace, comparing him to Nero. The comparison is unfair, but not totally unfair. They both used violence liberally and directed it against members of their own family. They also both left Rome in ruins, though in very different ways. Nero, of course, was a buffoon, and whatever you think of him, you can't say that of Constantine. Constantine was a great emperor. He had the most influential reign of the 100 or so holders of that post, but he was definitely not a saint. We'll be burying him in the next episode, but you'll probably notice that we haven't yet covered the most important aspect of his reign, which is religion. Gibbon devotes a couple of chapters to this after he covers the events following the succession to Constantine. You can't really do justice to the reign of Julian the Apostate without having the detailed background of the continuing rise of the church, but I'm hoping to get the church stuff out of the way as quickly as possible. I'll see how few episodes I can crush it down into. In the meantime, thanks for listening.